Similitude, besides being the episode title that most sounds like a word made up by George W. Bush, brings us back to the Xindi arc. 10 episodes into Season 3 and just preceding the horrible Carpenter Street. We kick off with a funeral.
The most difficult test facing any captain, any crew, is the loss of a shipmate.
I don't know. I think if given the choice, I'd pick this over having to hunt down and destroy an alien superweapon alone and in a space filled with anomalies that could turn you inside out. Of course, the crew of Enterprise get to do both! Yay! We learn that the person they're mourning is Tucker, which it doesn't make any sense. He can't die now. Then he won't be able to die pointlessly later on. After we learn about the title singer's misplaced faith in his singing ability, Tucker and T'Pol are engaged in mutual foot rubs while Tucker shows off his chiseled physique, all while babbling about his new warp drive refinements.
I'm talking about a ride so smooth, you can build a house of cards on the warp reactor.
An apt metaphor. I often associate your work on the reactor with a house of cards. Now, I was being facetious. It's not a foot rub. It's a Vulcan technique that blah, blah, blah. It helps Tucker deal with the whole death of his sister thing, and it advances the Tucker/T'Pol subplot. Not that you'd be able to tell. I mean, there's nothing remotely sexual about any of this, is there? Speaking of moving a little fast, we're ready to try Trip's new warp system, which works fine for a good 7 seconds, and then everything goes to hell. The ship is thrashing about, the controls are locked out, and the reactor is belching fire. And after Tucker fixes this mess, the wall explodes and flings him across the room, as well as starting fires on B and C deck, and all thanks to Tucker thinking he could improve the engines. Please remember this, it's going to be important soon. In fact, the only thing that stopped Enterprise from continuing to fly off at warp is that they passed into some kind of anomaly that stopped them. It's going to take days, possibly weeks, to fix the damage that this has caused. Archer checks up on Tucker, and I'm afraid there's bad news. Tucker's in a coma and can't work on the engine. But there is also good news. Tucker's in a coma and can't work on the engine. I know I'm being very mean to Trip this week. It's just hard not to be when things go disastrously wrong because of a guy that his creator said learned everything about spaceships from working on a boat. All I can think is that this kind of thing should happen every week on this show. Either that or they should just give in and claim that he's some idiot savant that's convinced that Enterprise is actually a basic cable fishing show. Archer stops by and Phlox introduces him to another of his circus of horrors.
A Lycerian desert larvae. Its epidermal layer secretes a viral suppressant that I use as a salve for cuts and bruises.
How does this relate to Trip?
I'd like to put his head in a jar. Do you have any about this size? Nah, I'm kidding. Phlox would never do anything so cliche as putting Tucker's head in a jar. No, he wants to clone him. This larva will become a clone of Tucker that will live its entire lifespan in 15 days, but this way they can harvest neural tissue from it to save Trip, though why that tissue won't expire in 15 days with the rest of the clone is just glossed over because the episode loves doing that kind of thing. While Archer mulls over turning a jellyfish into a copy of his chief engineer, T'Pol gives a report on what's happening outside. There's particles that are highly magnetic and thus drawn to the ship and coating it, forming a hard shell that they had to blast off just to get a sample. If they stay too long, tech, they're all going to die. So that's another thing on the to-do list. Not die. T'Pol asks about the cloning thing, and Archer says he's already approved the procedure, even after she mentions that on the world this critter comes from, not only is the procedure highly illegal, it's also incredibly unethical. But when has that ever stopped Phlox, huh? No, seriously, when has that ever stopped Phlox? Wait, there was the one with the tentacles. He felt Reed was inflicting pain on the fragment. So there you go. Ethic applies to detached body parts, not entire bodies. That's different. Archer's reasoning on why he's doing this, though, is simple.
We've got to complete this mission. Earth needs Enterprise. Enterprise needs Trip.
If they didn't have Trip, who else's science experiments would lock out the controls, blow out panels, and set the engine and several decks on fire? The ethics of cloning are obviously highly controversial and have been considered in science fiction for far longer than science has deemed the very process practical. For instance, the moral issues around the clone army of Star Wars, where countless duplicates of sapient beings are brought into existence simply to fight a war against robots. In other works, there's things like sapient clones that are raised in a seeming paradise, just waiting for the day that they'd be murdered for their organs. But even when you take the sapience away, there's trouble, as explored in one of Larry Niven's short stories, where a man reveals to his bartender that after visiting an alien planet and getting a routine medical examination, their DNA is scanned and is going to be used to produce mindless clones of him and the rest of the visitors so that those clones can be eaten. While religions of various types have lots of opinions on science topics that some argue get in the way of science progress, cloning goes far beyond to be a far more serious issue from purely secular points of view. Manny Coto, who kicked off his Star Trek writing career with this story, uses the larva to consider the idea of human cloning ethics, so let's see how that works out. Archer's decision reminds me a bit of Janeway's in Nothing Human, about whether or not to use knowledge acquired by a scientist who engaged in morally bankrupt experiments, and employed similar reasoning to Archer. We can't afford to lose our chief engineer. Do the procedure. Obviously, the situations are very different, but it stuck out because that was a time when there was no room for half measures. Janeway had no time to wring her hands and no third way out. So she quickly womaned up, made the choice that she felt was demanded, and took ownership of it. For me, it was a glimpse of the Janeway that the show had needed, but almost never had. The strength of character to take command and do a hard thing, without the arrogance that often came with it that said, there is no other possible answer that's right but what our captain has said. She knows she may be doing the wrong thing, but the hard price for the big chair is to own the big mistakes. We'll see if Archer can likewise handle this.
3 days ago, he was just another one of your creatures.
Yeah, that's another weird bit. It's like you made the clone out of Vaseline or something. Archer is clearly tortured at the ethical implications of this, while Phlox approaches ethical dilemmas as expected, with bemusement. Who's an affront to God and nature, huh? It's you! Yes, it's you! Speaking of which, better change your diaper, kid. He names the baby Sim, short for Similitude, and I suppose the kid should be grateful he wasn't named Clone or Bootleg. To add to the weirdness, as Sim grows older, he begins to remember Trip's life up to that age. Phlox attributes this to human race memory, and that should be obvious. That's why Picard had to tell his life story to Shinzon, because Shinzon really wanted to hear everything that he already knew. Archer bonds with Sim a little in anticipation of revealing the truth that he's been created to save Trip's life.
Dr. Phlox says I'm not allowed to go in there.
And he listened? Wow, this really is science fiction. As Archer notes to Sim, he's not just a copy, because he has his own memories that he's forming in addition to Trip's memories, so that makes him a unique individual. Yet at the same time, he only exists because he's made to be a copy of Trip, and he's a reminder of Trip to everybody else, which is why T'Pol has a problem when adolescent Sim tries asking her out several times. But before I get into that, Archer interrupts with news. The buildup of their M&M candy shell is generating a magnetic field so powerful that in 4 days everything on board will be offline, even T'Pol's back massager, so something has to be done about that right now. Well, the next day, Trip is grown enough to remember all his engineering know-how and comes up with a plan. Shoot their own ship! As you can see, it's exactly the same as most of the real Trip's plans, just more direct in their effect. Actually, Trip's thinking is that they blast the hangar doors open, release the shuttle pods, and have them tow the ship out of the field. It's a crazy plan, but that's probably exactly what they need right now. But that's still not crazy enough. Sim wants to pilot one of those shuttles based solely on the memories Trip has of how to do that. Even Archer thinks that's a bad idea, and this is a man who values his dog over his ship. Sim figures he knows the real reason, though, that if he dies, there goes the chance to save Trip.
So your concern for my safety is really about saving Trip?
My main concern is that this plan work. If we don't make it out of here in the next 6 hours, it won't matter whether Trip survives or not. We'll all be dead.
Archer has a point. There's 4 words that rarely go together. Well, we may not trust Sim to pilot the shuttle pods, but why don't we give him something easier, like shooting our own ship without damaging it badly? That sounds like a softball task. It works, thankfully, which means that Mayweather gets to leave his chair and do something. As you probably could have predicted, this scene is handled with the same reasoning as a car stuck in the mud. It's not moving at all, and then suddenly, right before they're ready to stop, then it starts moving. We've gotten it unstuck from nothingness. Yay! So what's your big reward? The news that when Phlox does the transplant, it will kill him. Yay! It seems his model was missing information that reveals that taking that much neurotissue will kill Sim. Gosh. Fortunately, you've never used your belief that you can accurately predict the future to do something questionable, Phlox. Unless you count allowing an entire species to die out. Yes, I'm never going to let that go. Sim isn't particularly pleased, and noting that since he'll be dead in less than a week, it seems that taking his life is obvious. Except...
Did you come across any references to the Valandran Circle?
That's the place where the ships vanish, right? No, that's the Bermuda Triangle, Doc. These scientists conducted illegal experiments on these clones and said they found an enzyme that could stop the accelerated aging process, and Phlox kept that a secret. Phlox claims that, yes, he did, but it was because there's little empirical evidence to suggest it could work, so there was no need to cloud the issue. Now, take a moment to think about the disregard shown for this clone. Phlox suggests a procedure deemed illegal and unethical by the planet of origin of this creature because he sees no other way to possibly save Trip. Without it, he will die. Now here stands Sim, a sapient being with a terminal illness, his rapid aging, and there's a possible cure. And Phlox's response is to keep the treatment to himself. See why I said I wasn't letting that Valachian thing go? To lose one cure may be regarded as misfortune. To lose two looks like carelessness. Archer isn't handling it well either. When he catches Sim staying in Trip's quarters, he can barely contain his rage.
Then what am I? Just something you grew in a lab? Does that make it easier for you to condemn me to death?
Oh yes, that much is obvious. Remember that Sim is like his best friend in virtually every way, and he has a terminal illness. To save his best friend, he must put him through that horror and just console himself with the fact that it wasn't really him. Trip will have no memories of any of this, only Archer. And Archer's protecting himself by not only insisting to himself that this isn't his friend, he's protecting himself by insisting that he isn't a person.
So what are you going to do? Drag me down to sick bay? Force me onto a biobed at gunpoint?
If you truly have all of Trip's memories, you know the answer to that. I don't have to tell you what's at stake. I must complete this mission. And to do that, I need Trip. Trip! I'll take whatever steps necessary to save him.
Even if it means killing me?
Even if it means killing you.
Because think about that a minute. If this were any member of the crew who was compatible with Trip, some low-ranking security guard, do you really think Archer would order that man or woman be killed for their tissues in order to save Trip? To save his dog, maybe. Because Sim's a clone, he doesn't have the same rights as anyone else in Archer's eyes. I said that nothing human showed how Janeway stood up under pressure. Similitude shows how Archer cracks under it. In response, Sim locks out controls that would stop him from taking off in a shuttle pod, but he doesn't leave, half because there's nowhere to really go, but the other half because of what happened to his sister because of the Xindi. He wants to see them stopped. So he voluntarily undergoes the procedure. Really voluntarily, I mean, not like when Harry gets volunteered to clean out Janeway's scorpion tank. So the ending is naturally to show that this is not Trip's funeral, it's Sim's, who gets the photon torpedo tube burial in space, and the end. Post-episode follow-up, annoying character goes to Phlox for his crime against nature. Again. Final score for Similitude is 8 out of 10, though it's not an easy call. Connor Trinneer gives an exemplary performance, and Manny Koto gives a great bit of drama. This is considered quite a popular episode amongst fans of Enterprise, probably for both those reasons. What I didn't like was that they mentioned ethics, but they didn't seem to really explore them very well. Sim seems okay with them deciding to call him into being for a brief time just to die, and no one else seems put out by that. As I said, Archer seems to be denying the issues as a coping mechanism, but his speech at the funeral does nothing except recognize his sacrifice. No one seems the least bit put out over what they had put him through. Not even Sim in the end. It comes across as, "Tonight, Enterprise looks at the complicated questions surrounding human cloning." I'm okay with it. Problem solved. I'm not saying it had to be tortured with ethical questions, but the way it's handled seems to be, well, things worked out for Trip, so I guess this was all a good thing. But then it probably speaks of its time, with Archer repeatedly using the fact that Enterprise must complete its mission to justify all of this, as with him beating information out of a man in the following episode. It tapped into the same sentiment of the time that said, we'll do whatever's necessary in the name of keeping people safe. The difference I find with this and Damage, when he had to steal the ship's warp core, was that there, it was Archer being told that literally his only hope was to do something he knew was wrong, and then having to do it. With these other instances, Archer's not backed into a corner. He doesn't grimly decide to do the only thing he can do. He uses flimsy rationalization to justify choosing the easiest thing to do.
All hail the Overlord! All hail the Overlord!
Can you imagine a lousier way to spend your old age? Cooped up in that thing?